On this episode of Healing from Within with Tony Valen, Brett Bevell talks about his book, Healing Racism Within, A Lightworker's Guide. From a deep place within his heart, Brett Bevell is supporting us in realizing that racism exists, not only through our unjust laws and the dysfunctional systemic policies in our businesses, schools, and government, but also in our cells, our emotions, our brains, and our hearts, the ghosts of our ancestors and the family systems we've inherited. And like other forms of disease, it can be addressed and healed if we look at it fiercely and honestly and have the courage to act accordingly. Next on Healing from Within with Tony Valen. Hi, I'm Tony Valen. Welcome.
Healing from within.
Brett, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate it. We got your book and looked into it, Healing Racism Within, A Lightworker's Guide. So we looked into doing some research on you, and for the most part, we could see that you are known as an energy healer. So why a book about racism? What made you choose that subject?
Yeah, I feel like really the subject chose me in a way. I feel that part of my healing journey has been about overcoming not only issues around severe childhood abuse, growing up in a very traumatic environment, but also witnessing the murder of a Black man when I was a young toddler. And part of my own healing journey has involved energy healing around that to release that pain, release that trauma from myself. And also I've noticed that in that kind of digging into my psyche with Reiki and other forms of energy healing, that I've also been able to release, or I feel that I've been able to release a lot of the unconscious racial bias that I was carrying, having grown up in a very racist environment. And so I feel that these are tools that are valuable to people and are valuable to society, and that it just seemed like if they're there and if I'm aware of them, I might as well share them with people who can benefit from them.
Right. So what you just spoke about was chapter 1 of your book, and it's titled The Wound That We Cannot See. What exactly do you mean when you say the wound we cannot see?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of psychological filters and cultural filters that we have that keep us from really looking at the deep trauma that exists in our society around issues of race. Mm-hmm. And I think of that in terms of my own personal experience, where I really, I think, noticed that the most was when I was doing my master's thesis in San Francisco State University. This was in the late 1990s. And the master's thesis involved me doing a poetry performance. The poetry performance involved some very graphic and honest expressions around the race-based murder that I had witnessed when I was a child. And I noticed after I did that event, well, first of all, it felt like in this one performance that it felt like about, several $1,000s worth of therapy for me. But beyond that, I started to notice that even though San Francisco is considered to be, a liberal or sort of progressive place, that when I would read those same poems at open mics in the San Francisco Bay Area, that I would reach this huge sense of anger and resentment aimed at me, which I didn't understand. I'm like, what is this about? Why are people who seem to be always, quoting Dr. Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or people of the civil rights movement, why are they angry about me just honestly expressing something that I witnessed as a child that was horrible? What is that anger about? And when I really dug into that, I really have the sense that there's a sense of people just not wanting to talk about the harsher details of the real pain and the real trauma that has existed in our nation for hundreds of years when we think of, one group of human beings actually owning as property another group of human beings, and what that meant also in terms of the abuse and suffering that those human beings endured because of that, and also the suffering and pain of the children of those beings, and how that's get passed on generationally. And also when you think of it just in terms of through the open eyes of a child, let's just imagine for a moment, the open eyes of a child, of some white child who may have been a child hundreds of years ago on a plantation, seeing what their parents or what their grown-ups were doing to other people. What does that do to that child, right? And how does that become then internalized into behavior that represses those emotions, that doesn't want to look at that pain? And how does that all get buried in our being on a cultural level, on a large scale level? And so I feel that these tools that I offer in the book are about ways that we can bring healing to that, and hopefully bring more light into our hearts and into our souls, and hopefully bring more healing to our country as a whole.
Right. I also noticed that you mentioned that you're married to a woman of color. How did you come about meeting a woman of color and taking her as your wife? I mean, considering, what you were exposed to and the life that you had exposed to.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, well, we met at the Omega Institute, which is where we both worked. I still work there.
Mhm.
We were both seasonal staff at the time, and so that's how I met her, was through that. And it's interesting that in the first couple of weeks of our connecting, I actually shared with her some of the poems that were part of the master's thesis that I told you about earlier. And even though she uh, found those poems to be very raw and very maybe had to take a little step back from the intensity of those poems, I think she also respected my honesty and my willingness to look at deeper kind of cultural, racial issues that exist in our world. And so I think on a certain level, maybe it was a bonding for us that I shared that poetry with her. And maybe it was instinct that caused me to share those poems with her, because I don't always share them with everybody. So, yeah.
In your book, you also mentioned the N word. That was in chapter 3. The language has incredible power to do harm, very much against the old sticks and stones saying. Can you tell us, what you discovered about the N word and the power it holds?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, so it's really interesting because I was raised in almost kind of a split environment where on my father's side of the family, they were very extremely outwardly racist, right? It was just, and my parents were divorced. So my father's side, it was just very blatant. It was there, easy to see. On my mother's side, she externalized this kind of very liberal persona, um, and yet beneath that there was still this sense of racial hatred, if you want to call it that, for lack of a better word.
Right.
And I would notice it coming up sometimes in the way, not so much the way that she would speak, but sometimes in the way her parents would speak, referring to Black people as those people, or they don't know their place, and all these kind of weird phrases that you, when you look at it, you can read between the lines that's just filled with hatred. And even though I grew up not really saying the N word, I think it was in my mind. I think it was in all of our minds on some level. And it wasn't until I moved to Oakland, California, and this was during the start of the first Persian Gulf War, and I was working in a fast food place called Quickway, where the vast majority of both the employees as well as the clients there were Black Americans. And so I began to learn what it felt like to be the other, to be in the minority, to have people look at me in ways that maybe didn't always feel that good, because I felt at that time, again, it was during the Persian Gulf War, the first Persian Gulf War. And I think a lot of people in that community felt or assumed that I, as a white person, was probably for the war, even though I wasn't. And so there would sometimes be comments, like little jeers or jabs at me at the window as I'm handing out the food, about the war and about, oh, well, you don't have to worry about the war because you're a white guy. And it's all of our people that are fighting this war. And so I was also very aware of the disproportionate representation that, that many people in our service, in the Army and our Marine Corps, et cetera, disproportionately are often people of color. And so I was aware that what they were saying was true. And even though internally and externally I agreed with them, I could feel their anger pointed at me, and collectively over a period of time, I started to imagine I'm experiencing this now as a white guy working at a fast food restaurant, right? Mm-hmm. What is it like for a person of color who's experiencing that on a daily basis at school, on the street, in the grocery store, experiencing that lens of hatred and anger that is always being kind of dished out at people, whether it's through the N-word or other ways of just, being discriminated against. And so it really made me look at just the deep pain, the painful energy that is in that word. And so also as a child, I was often mimicked and called different names by my father and my brother, and in ways that were meant to demean me. So I also realized that in that aspect, that's what is happening on a larger scale, that when we use names in a harmful way, when we call people something, first of all, that they don't want to be called, and we use it as a way to denigrate, just how deeply debilitating and painful that is. And so it just felt important in this book to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that that it's a word that needs to be, hands off. Like, right. Sometimes I think white people think, oh, why is it okay if a black person says it? And I think in sometimes black people are trying to reclaim that word in their own way, whether it's through rap music or other ways. And so I just think it's like, we don't have the right to really say it or speak it. There's too much pain there. There's too much trauma there. And so it's really just kind of an honest reflection on my own journey with that.
Right. I've also heard the other side of that is that some people I've spoken to, both black and white, feel that if the use of that word, the more common it becomes, it takes more power away from that word. Do you believe that to be true, or what do you think? Because I honestly don't know. I would never use the word. It feels wrong. But I'll
just say I would never use the word, and I do feel that there's a negative energy in the word.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't want to cast judgment upon black people who feel that by saying the word that they are reclaiming it. Mm-hmm. I feel like I can't judge that. I just know that for me, I'm not going to say it and not trying to give energy to it. Yeah.
Right. So let me, I'm going to ask you this question, but I want to also tell you a little story. So I have a friend that had other coworkers that were, kind of friends, and they were going to go on vacation. So they, said, can you please take care of our dogs? And so he said, yeah, sure. He met with them for dinner, and, he had never really had a conversation with them until that dinner. And during that time, it was from COVID and everybody was working from home. And then he got into a conversation with them, and he really liked these people. But then all of a sudden, the ugly side of racism started popping in the conversation. Like the guy, the husband was talking about how he's so happy to be working from home instead of working in the office, because in the office he was right by the kitchen, and those Indian people would come in with their smelly food, and those damn Indians with their food, they're horrible, and on and on and on. Then the wife, was later on in the conversation, they're talking about going on vacation to Hawaii. She starts going into the fact that, she's, there's all these Japanese people and blah, blah, blah. And so anyway, she goes into her rant. And then after the fact, he really didn't say much of it. He just listened to it and tried to change the subject. But then he was having a conversation with me, and he said, what would you have done? He said, I feel like such a coward because it was something that really just was wrong, and I felt it. but I still didn't have the courage to go against it. How can we,
Mhm.
as people on the street, deal with people that act that way?
I mean, that's a very important point, and I think the word cowardice is something that I do talk about in my book that I refer to as white cowardice, in the sense that I do think that I think sometimes we hear the term privilege. Maybe I'm going a little off topic here, but
No.
even though I understand the concept of white privilege and I'm not disagreeing with that term, there's something about that term that to me feels a little antiseptic, like it just feels a little too in the head.
Mhm.
And I feel like when we really break it down, like it's really more about cowardice and the inability or the unwillingness to have the courage to speak out against something that we all know is wrong and that we all know needs to be rectified in our society. And I think, again, when I talk about all the psychological filters, the cultural filters that exist in our world around issues of race, that I think many times as a white person, it's very easy to just not engage in a moment like that where your friend's talking about. So there's that sense of choice. Oh, I'm just not going to engage it. When we have to really sit back and realize that by not engaging it, we're allowing that activity to still continue in our society. And even though we think it's a choice to not engage, it's actually an act of cowardice. It's an act of refraining from doing what we actually know is the right thing to do, which
Right.
is to speak truth to it. And even though that might be uncomfortable at times, I think we just need to really build an awareness and actually, think of it as a muscle. You need to work that muscle and build it and make it stronger and stronger. So to just find the courage within ourselves to speak up when we are in those kinds of moments.
Right. And so I think, well, what more specifically, what I was trying to ask or get an answer to was, like for me, I can speak against it, but I don't want to get confrontational. If anything, I want to get to the point of educating them, making them understand the education you felt. You said you started feeling all that, and you started thinking about, well, if I had to feel this every day of my life, how that would be horrible.
Yeah.
How do we? I mean, how can we educate people without getting confrontational? Or do you know?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. And again, by me saying that you have to speak up about it doesn't mean that you have to do it in a way that's confrontational.
Mhm.
There's other ways to look at that. For example, when he was talking about, he said the man had issues with the fact that his coworkers were cooking Indian food.
Yeah.
There's ways to look at that and just ask, you know, have you ever tried the Indian food? I mean, for me, that, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I love Indian food myself personally. I actually love the smell of Indian food that often fills my house when my wife's cooking. So,
Mm.
why does a person initially have to jump to a place of being offended by the smell of Indian food any more than they would the smell of barbecue or the smell of Mexican food or the smell of a roast turkey? I don't know. I'm just saying, like to just sometimes just dig in with a question to somebody. I love the smell of biryani. Why does that offend you? And maybe dig into it to where the person is then having to look at their own biases, their own um, silent agreements. I think sometimes we have these silent agreement, this kind of like wink and nod kind of assumption that, oh well, every other white person is just going to agree with my bias. And if you call people on it, sometimes that can make them actually step back and reflect and ask themselves some questions that maybe they weren't willing to ask before. So um, there are times when I think a direct confrontation is needed, but I hear what you're saying. That's not always the most appropriate response, and that's not always the response that is going to help convince somebody to change their behavior. So sometimes just leaning in with a question uh, like that can be helpful.
Yeah. Right. So let's go back to the side of healing. You talk
Yeah.
about uh, the 3-week journaling exercise, authenticity, is the key to the exercise. So can you please tell us about that? Your
Sure. So in the book, I talk about a journaling exercise where you go for 3 weeks, and at first you're just really writing about your feelings around things that might trigger you um, in society, and I'll just use myself as an example because in my own history, growing up in a family where there was a lot of racial bias, one thing that used to trigger me a lot, even into my years of college, and this sounds absurd when I say it now, but at the time it would trigger me, would be when I would hear people speaking in another language. Now, when I think that's ridiculous, first of all, that would be a trigger, but it's something I inherited from my grandparents, right? We lived in New Mexico, and they, for whatever reason, they would get very riled up when there were people speaking Spanish, even though the Spanish speaking people in New Mexico had lived there far longer than we had, for hundreds of years. Families have been speaking Spanish there, and yet my grandparents would get upset when they heard somebody speaking Spanish. So I really started tracking that, like, oh, is that really my thought? Is that really my discomfort? Or is that something that I've just inherited from my grandparents and that I'm kind of taking on as my own? So in the 3-week journaling exercise, you're just writing about, first of all, things that might arise for you, whether it's feeling uncomfortable about somebody, whether it's something culturally that they say, something being triggered by, whatever, and just really noting those feelings, being honest about them, not trying to be politically correct about them necessarily, but just being authentic in your journal and writing about them. And then after that, digging deeper into, like, well, why did I feel that way? What made me have that reaction? Was that something that I learned about in school, or from a coworker, or from a relative? Where is the origin of that bias or that hatred or that anger? And becoming more familiar with it, and then really leaning into ways to change that thought and to change that pattern. Giving yourself a 3-week process where you're, not having to feel like you're having to change yourself overnight, but that you can really journal about and write about these processes over time.
right. Yeah, yeah. Just like the guy that my friend was talking about. Maybe if he started writing down whenever, because his trigger obviously was the smell of food, certain food. So, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. You also talk about the rules of racism. Can you tell us what you mean by the rules of racism?
Sure. So Brules, that's a term that I'm borrowing from Vishen Lakhiani, who's the founder of Mind Valley. He also has written a number of books. One's called Code of the Extraordinary Mind. Um, and he's a fabulous teacher. I really highly recommend people exploring his work. Um, but he talks about rules, which basically is short for bullshit rules. And the bullshit rules are the rules that we sometimes don't really even question. We just accept them as true. Um, and in his work, he's often inviting us to question those bullshit rules. And I've noticed in looking at how kind of the racial landscape of our culture, how there are a lot of bullshit rules that show up. And I mean, one of the bullshit rules is to, again, feeling like that as a white person, that it's okay to not talk about issues of race, that we can just kind of sidestep it and do whatever we need to do to be comfortable. Like, that's kind of a bullshit rule. But a bigger, deeper bullshit rule that I think is important to really look at is this idea that exists in a large part of our culture, this kind of romanticized vision of the South, of kind of, these happy plantations, and that, kind of like something out of Gone with the Wind. And as opposed to really realizing, no, people were owning other human beings, that Black people were being shipped, like, literally like sardines next to each other, crammed in these boats across the ocean, and many people were dying on those journeys. And that, imagine being enslaved and having, metal harnesses around your hands for much of your life, and being chained. I mean, just really let that sink in, and realize, oh, there's nothing romantic about that vision of the South. There's nothing to be proud of about that heritage. And so when, I hear these kind of trigger terms like, oh, it's our heritage, and, oh, being proud of the Old South or the Confederate flag, when you really break it down and you think about it in the fine details, there's nothing to be proud about. And it's a, again, a bullshit rule that this is something that we should be honoring in terms of, whether it's statues or in our school books or whatever. There's nothing to honor there. It's totally dishonorable activities, and so we just need to name it as such. And so those are just some bullshit rules that I talk about in the book.
Right. Which basically, I mean, what you just finished saying is exactly what I was going to lead to my next question. You talk about writing a letter of empathy. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think writing a letter of empathy to it could be a real letter that you actually mail to somebody, but if you're not comfortable with that, that's fine. In my book, I often share and talk about a letter that I wrote to the spirit of Muhammad Ali as a child, as a young child, even though, um, again, I lived in a very racist environment. As a child, I had a great deal of admiration for Muhammad Ali. I loved his rhyming poetry. I loved the wit that he had. I admired him as an athlete. Um, and and I feel like he was kind of one of my childhood idols. And so in the book, I talk about writing a letter to his spirit, to acknowledge that, kind of connecting with somebody who is of a different race than your own, and to acknowledge the powerful or courageous or beautiful things that exist in that person or those people. It's just a way to start to build empathy. And so again, in the book, I share a letter that I wrote to the spirit of Muhammad Ali. And if you're writing to somebody who's dead, what I do is I write the letter fully as though I was going to pop it in the mailbox to somebody who's living. But instead, what I then do is I kind of ritually burn the letter with the intention that the words on that page are then going out to the spirit of that person, so that they're kind of hearing that letter on the other plane of reality.
Very nice. I know that I had asked you the question and about how to deal with people, talking in a certain way, and you're right there, and you know it's wrong, so you do use words. But other than words, how can we stop people or make people aware of the racism they're putting out there? Is there other ways?
Well, I think a lot of my book, I mean, there are other ways, though I think a big piece about my book is really first starting with ourselves, because I think even those of us, myself, who might consider themselves to be fairly progressive or socially liberated and have done a lot of inner work, the thing is, the more work that I do, the more I see that still needs to be done.
Right.
And so the analogy I use is that, um, I often see uh, in environmental conferences and stuff, which they have a lot of at Omega Institute, we'll hear how there's microplastics in everything, right? We all, each of us, probably have at least a credit card worth of microplastics in us at any given point in time,
Right.
right? And so it doesn't matter what water you're drinking or how well you're trying to eat, it's in you, right?
Mm.
And I look at our culture as being the same way around issues of race. So no matter how progressive we might feel politically, or how much work we might have done, or how maybe we've read books about white privilege or about our history and have intellectualized all that, I still think even in those moments, there's still work that needs to be done inside of each of us. And that, using that analogy of that, we all have microplastics in us. I think too, we all have some level of racism in us.
Mm. Right.
It's not always about the neighbor. It's not always about that grandparent. It's in us because it's woven into our society in
Yeah.
ways that are very I don't I would say insidious, but also just universal. Like it's in the morphogenetic field of our culture.
Right.
And it's not that I'm going to point fingers about how did that get created. The bottom line is it's there, it exists in our culture. And the way we can be empowered as individuals is, first of all, by recognizing that it exists and doing the inner work that we each individually need to do to then take it out of our own systems. And then once you start moving it out of your own system, then you can feel more empowered to have discussions with, whether it's coworkers or family members or people that you feel that you might need to educate, that's important work and that needs to be done. But I think we first need to start with ourselves. And again, whether it's through doing the journaling work or the art therapy work that's in the book or the energy healing that is in the book invites different practices. The hope is that, maybe not all of them will appeal to each person, but hopefully each person can at least find a couple of them that will resonate and that will help them do the inner work to really begin to release that racism that I think exists in all of us.
Right. Yeah, another technique, and I'm only mentioning a couple of the techniques, but one of the techniques that stood out to me, and please tell everyone about it, affirmations and lofty questions. Tell us about that technique.
Yeah, so affirmations, I mean, most people have heard of affirmations. I first heard of affirmations in my mid 20s, and I was taught one by a chiropractor at a very important time in my life when I really needed that work. And it was to stand in front of a mirror and tap my heart and say 3 times, I deeply love and appreciate myself. I deeply love and appreciate myself. I deeply love and appreciate myself. And that one affirmation really carried me through a number of years of some very troubled times. I would say that affirmation was kind of like my life raft through a period of great turmoil in my life. And in working with affirmations in that way, I'm like, well, why can't we also just adapt affirmations to also engage issues around race? And instead of just I deeply love and appreciate myself, why not I deeply love and appreciate all people of all races? I deeply love and appreciate all people of all races. I deeply love and appreciate all people of all races. And that's one that I'm just literally making up right now. But we can all engage in that same kind of work, or even just, looking in the mirror and tapping your heart 3 times and saying, I deeply love and appreciate all people of color. And that's not to say that I don't appreciate white people, because I do, but to really kind of then focus it on somebody who you might see as the other or as different, and really kind of, again, start to wire your brain to be more open in that way. So that's exploring affirmations in that way. Lofty questions, again, I learned about lofty questions through the work of Christy Marie Sheldon on the Mind Valley app. And a lofty question is a little bit different than an affirmation. It's actually a question that you would ask that causes your subconscious mind to then kind of want to answer it in a certain way. The lofty questions that many people might use just in general were like, why does the universe always have my back? Or why am I so good at always generating abundance, right? So that's just a general lofty question that one might use. But again, you can also fine tune them so that they're more about race, right? Or being more open. So, a lofty question of that nature would be something like, why am I always so accepting and loving for people who are of different races, right? And with lofty questions, the thing to do is to like post them on your refrigerator or on your door, or maybe somewhere in your office, so that you see them often. And what's happening is each time you see them, what goes on with a lofty question is when you see the question, or when you hear the question, or you think the question, your subconscious mind is then always trying to answer that question, and it will start to create things in your life, in your field, that answer that question, right? So it will help you. It's kind of a backdoor way to get your subconscious mind to start working on something, and I find them to be very effective. So the book has a few, again, that are lofty questions around, healing that racism that exists within us.
Right. The other thing also that you mentioned in your book, and it's a way of being empathetic, but at the same time a matter of education, and that is when you talk about how racism really destroys culture, because it demeans it. It just makes people feel bad about who they are, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah. And I also talk in the book about culture loss, and this idea that that by not acknowledging the loss or the grief that many of us have around, for example, I'll just use myself as an example. My heritage is many different cultures. So there's French, there's German, there's Greek, there's Dutch, there's Irish, there's Cherokee, and in all of that, I can't say that I honestly know much about any of those cultures. I mean, a little from what I've read around history books, but I can't say that I really feel a connection to the Greek part of me, or a deep connection to the French part of me, or a deep connection to the Dutch part of me, or the German part of me, or the Irish part of me, or the Cherokee part of me. I'm somewhat divorced from all of that ancestral wisdom and all that ancestral knowledge that, in many cultures would be celebrated in profound ways in terms of rituals of empowerment and healing and ways of understanding, the cycles of life and death. All that cultural wisdom, for me personally, with all that I am, Greek, German, Cherokee, Dutch, Irish, all that is, I don't know it, right? Because I was never raised to appreciate it. And so for me, looking at the grief that is there around being somewhat spiritually divorced from those cultures and how they influence me as a white person, I think that that's also something that many white people carry and that many of us are totally oblivious to. The idea of culture loss, again, is not something that I came up with. I learned about it from my dear mentor, a woman named Caroline, who has since passed on. And it was her belief that really it isn't until we really look at culture loss as it exists within us that we can then empathize with the culture loss that exists for indigenous cultures and people of the culture of people in colors, where cultures have been literally just wiped out and diminished in such a horrific way. So it's kind of a two-step process where first we need to grieve that culture loss that existed within ourselves and in our own heritage.
Yeah.
And then when we can acknowledge that and we can open that heart space within ourselves, then we can have empathy for the massive devastation that has occurred to other cultures through the history of the past 500 years of colonialism and genocide, etc.
Right. So if someone wanted to get more information about you and the book, where can people go to find the book and more information about you?
Sure. So the book is available pretty much anywhere: Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop. Also, your local bookstore. If they don't carry it, you could probably easily order it from them if you want to support your local bookshop, which I'm always in favor of. And information about me, my website is brettbevell.com. That's BRETT.BEV. No, not dot. BRETTBEVELL.com. I was starting to give my email, which has a dot between my name.
Right. Well, Brett, thank you so much for being on the show. We appreciate it. And the book is Healing Racism Within, a Light Worker's Guide. Brett, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.